Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Misery by Stephen King. Now, Misery was published in 1987, and this is one of Stephen King's most famous books, and this is a book that for some reason I've always held off on reading. It's a book that for years people have been telling me, you gotta read Misery, man, you gotta read Misery, and I've had this copy of the book for a couple of years now, but for some reason I've just held off on reading it until not too long ago when I finally decided to pick it up, and I have to say that this is an excellent book. I can't say it's one of my personal favorite Stephen King books, but I do think this is actually one of King's most sophisticated books. Now, the reason I think this is one of King's most sophisticated books is, for one, this is one of his more reality-based stories. Most of Stephen King's books really deal with the supernatural and are usually in the realm of fantasy horror, and this book is definitely horror, but it's more reality-based horror. The premise of this novel is something that could actually happen, so this is one of his more reality-based horror stories. Also, aside from being a great psychological horror story, I also feel like this book really is a commentary on the art of writing in general and the art of storytelling, and I also think this book speaks to a lot of things that I'm sure a lot of writers, not just Stephen King, but I'm sure a lot of writers really think about, because the main character of this novel, Paul Sheldon, is a popular writer who desires to be taken more seriously by literary critics, and I'm sure that's something that Stephen King has really felt, because Stephen King is a writer who I think always wants to be taken seriously, but he is very much a popular writer. Now, I personally think Stephen King is a writer who really does a good job at skirting that line between popular fiction and serious fiction, but a lot of people really do debate the literary significance of King's work, and I'm sure a lot of the criticisms that King has gotten over the years I'm sure he's really felt the sting of those criticisms, and I feel like this book speaks to a lot of the things that I'm sure a lot of writers go through. This feeling that you want to be a serious writer, but you fall into the trap of popular fiction. And this book also speaks to obsessed fandom, and what really makes this book terrifying is there are people like Annie Wilkes out there. Now, Stephen King actually wrote this book as sort of a response to the fan reaction to his novel, The Eyes of the Dragon. Now, The Eyes of the Dragon was a fantasy novel. It was a fairy tale that he actually wrote for his then 13-year-old daughter, because his daughter wanted him to write something besides a horror story. So he wrote the novel, The Eyes of the Dragon, for his daughter, but fans apparently really reacted negatively towards that book. I actually think that book is quite good, but fans apparently really hated it, and they didn't like how it was something besides a horror story, and apparently, he got a lot of hate mail over it, saying, "What are you doing? This isn't you! You should stick to horror," and, I think he really felt, handcuffed by his fans, and he felt really tied down to the horror genre, and he felt like his fans were holding him hostage, so he wrote this novel to take the idea of being held hostage by your fans to a literal extreme. Now, I saw an interview once with Stephen King where he actually said that this was originally going to be a short story, and I could see this in a short story form because the premise of this novel is fairly simple, and it's simple enough where you could have written a 20-page long short story off this same premise, but apparently he expanded it into a full-length novel. I also heard that this was originally going to be published under Stephen King's pen name Richard Bachman, which prior to this he wrote books like The Long Walk, The Running Man, Roadwork, and Thinner under that pen name, but at the time he finally got around to publishing this, it was already found out that him and Richard Bachman were actually the same person, person, so he ended up just writing it under his actual name. Now, the plot of Misery is it's about this author named Paul Sheldon, who is most popular for this series of romantic adventure novels set in the 18th century featuring this character called Misery Chastain, and these are his most popular works, but he has grown to really resent these books because he considers them to be really melodramatic and really cheesy, and he resents the fact that these are his bestsellers, yet his quote-unquote serious work is pretty much ignored by his fans. And whenever he writes something outside of the Misery series, his fans usually react very negatively towards it. Now, in the beginning of the story, he wakes up in the home of this woman named Annie Wilkes, who claims to be his #1 fan. Now, as the book goes on, you realize that after finishing his latest novel, which he actually considers to be his best work, and it's a non-misery novel, he got into a car accident during this huge snowstorm, and this woman named Annie Wilkes saved him and took him back to her home, and she's a nurse, so she's been able to take care of him. But what happens is she asks him if she could read the manuscript for this new book he's been working on, and he allows her to, and she's really disapproving of it because it's not a Misery story. And then she finally reads the final Misery novel and discovers that he actually killed off the character of Misery, and after this she freaks the fuck out, and pretty much what she does throughout the entire story is she holds him hostage, and she's now forcing him to write a new Misery novel, and she even forces him to destroy the manuscript for this new novel he was working on, and basically she's threatening to kill him unless he finishes this new Misery novel and finds a way to realistically bring the character of Misery back. And the thing is, Annie's house is in the middle of nowhere, and he has broken legs, so he really can't go anywhere either. Like, he's literally trapped in this house and is literally writing to save his life. Now, as I said before, Misery is an excellent novel and really is a terrifying story. Like, I would definitely say that this story is every celebrity's worst nightmare, and you could be saying, well, if you're not a celebrity, why would you find it to be scary? But to me, the idea of this novel is horrifying because this could happen to anybody, whether you're a celebrity or not, but, like, the whole idea of being held hostage by somebody is just a terrifying idea through and through, and some of the things that Annie Wilkes does to Paul Sheldon in this book really are terrifying. Like, there's a certain point in this book where she leaves him alone in his room for days and days, and he has no food or water, and there's a certain point where he actually has to drink his own urine in order to stay hydrated. And while this is a great horror story, at the same time, there is a lot of dark humor in this story as well. Like, I would actually almost call this book somewhat of a satire on fandom and how obsessed fans can actually get, and there is some dark humor in this novel. Like, the character of Annie Wilkes, while being a terrifying character, there is something darkly funny about her as well. But the book has this brilliant mix of humor, horror, and character drama. And as I mentioned before, I really feel like this book is a great commentary on the art of writing in general and the art of storytelling in general. In fact, some of my favorite sections of this book there are whole sections of this book where you actually see the manuscript that Paul Sheldon is writing for this new Misery novel, and you actually get to read some parts of this new Misery novel, and those were some of my favorite sections of the book because, once again, the book really is kind of a commentary on the writing process and the process that a lot of writers have to go through in order to really get a story down, and story writing is not something that comes easily, and I know that myself because even though I'm not a published writer, I do try to write every so often, but the thing with me because I always procrastinate when I'm trying to write something, and I never get anything done, and I feel like this book very much is a commentary on the writing process. Now, for me personally, like, I actually did write one short story for one of my writing classes, and I only wrote it really because I needed that grade, and because I was under pressure, I finished it really in only an hour, and surprisingly I got an A- on this short story that I wrote, so I'm guessing the professor didn't totally hate it, and for me, like, I feel like I write better when I'm under pressure, and I'm reading this book, and here you have this writer who's writing under the ultimate pressure. He's literally writing to stay alive, and I really think the book, besides being a great horror novel, is also a brilliant commentary on the writing process. And once again, I feel like this book really speaks to something that a lot of writers go through. This idea that you're a popular writer, but you want to be taken more seriously as a writer, and you want your fiction to be taken more seriously. And the book does a really good job at talking about the differences between writing as a business and writing as an art form. And it also speaks to this idea of being tied down to one particular thing, one particular genre, or a particular series of books. And I know this book was written before J.K. Rowling wrote the Harry Potter novels, but the Harry Potter novels really are what she's most well known for, and I know that one non-Harry Potter book that she wrote really didn't go over well, and I sometimes wonder, did it not go over well because it wasn't a good book, or was it because it simply wasn't a Harry Potter novel? And I feel like somebody like J.K. Rowling is somebody who definitely feels tied down by the Harry Potter series. Now, of course, this book was written years before Harry Potter, so obviously Stephen King didn't have her in mind when he wrote this book, but I'm only using her as an example of a writer who's really tied down to one particular series. Just like I think Stephen King himself is a writer who for years has felt really tied down to the horror genre. And this book very much speaks to the idea of obsessed fandom with the character of Annie Wilkes, and Wilkes is somebody who really doesn't live in reality, and these misery novels really have become a part of her life to a certain extent, and when Paul Sheldon kills the character of Misery off, she acts like Paul actually killed a friend of hers or something. Like, she almost acts like the character of Misery is real, and I feel like Annie Wilkes is very much a commentary on people who can't separate fiction from reality. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I read a book, I do get really invested in the story, and I get into the characters in the books that I read, and whenever a character that I really like dies, I do sometimes tear up a little bit, or, you know, I'm sometimes disappointed. Oh, I really like that guy, but ultimately, though, even though I do get really invested in the books that I read, and in the stories that I read, ultimately I'm able to realize that those are just stories. They're fiction. They're not reality. But Annie Wilkes is somebody who really can't seem to separate reality from fiction, and I feel like there are people like Annie Wilkes out there. Now, I did actually find the character of Annie Wilkes to be a sympathetic character, at least to a certain extent, mainly because she doesn't live in reality, and there are certain points in this book where you really do get the idea that she doesn't 100% realize that what she's doing is wrong, so to a certain extent I did feel sympathy for her, but I only felt sympathy for her to a certain extent because she's still batshit crazy, and you realize that because she doesn't realize that everything she's doing is wrong, she won't listen to reason, and that makes her a far more horrifying character. But yeah, Misery by Stephen King is an excellent novel. If you haven't read this book, I would definitely recommend it. And as I said before, I can't say this is necessarily one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, but I will never deny that this is not one of Stephen King's best books, because I do think this is one of his most sophisticated novels, and it really is a great book, and if you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. Now, a lot of Stephen King's books actually take place in the same world, and even though this is one of King's more reality-based stories, it's still set in the same universe as some of his supernatural novels. For example, in this book, there's a certain scene where you get a minor connection to Stephen King's novel The Shining. Like, there's a certain point in this book where Annie Wilkes mentions the Overlook Hotel, and she mentions something that happened at the Overlook Hotel, which happened in the novel The Shining, and she even mentions the character of Jack Torrance from The Shining. Also in this book, there's a certain point where Paul recalls something that happened to him as a child, and he mentions that one of his mother's friends was this woman named Mrs. Kasprak, and that could potentially be the character of Eddie Kasprak's mother. Eddie Kasprak was one of the main characters of Stephen King's novel It, and even if she's not actually Kasprak's mother, maybe she's a relative of Eddie Kasprak, so you also get a little minor connection to King's novel It. Now, this book was made into a movie in 1990, which was directed by Rob Reiner, who also directed another great Stephen King adaptation, Stand By Me. But the movie Misery is one of my all-time favorite movies, and the movie does change quite a bit from the book, but I do think the film stayed true to the general themes of the novel. Now, the movie starred James Caan as Paul Sheldon and Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes, and both of them nailed their roles in that movie, and the movie has actually become really ingrained into pop culture. Like, even people who haven't seen the movie would instantly recognize certain scenes from the movie. And the movie has also been parodied many times as well. There was also a 2003 adaptation of this book that was actually an Indian film. Now, I never saw this particular version of Misery, so I really can't comment too much on it, but there was actually an Indian film that was an adaptation of this book. And I know recently there's actually been an off-Broadway play starring Bruce Willis that was based on this novel as well. But yeah, that was my review on Misery by Stephen King, and bye.